Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Kaweco Sunrise Orange. I'm going to do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Kaweco Sunrise Orange to other orange inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Kaweco Sunrise Orange looks good in this writing sample that I did with my glass dip nib, but I did have a little trouble getting the ink to grab the paper and come off the nib. So it wasn't an entirely pleasant writing experience. This swatch that I did with tweezers looks nice and crisp on this Tomoe River paper, but I had trouble getting the ink to grab the paper on Rhodia and my little ink collection cards that I use. The drip at the end of the swatch has a little halo of darker ink, but I'm not seeing any sheen. I'm going to begin with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This extra fine nib is not scratchy with this ink, but it does feel dry, even though I see I'm getting a decent amount of ink on the paper. And just the color of this ink, or the lightness of it, makes it a little less legible than I prefer. Next, I've got my Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel fine nib. This nib felt pretty feedbacky on this paper, and this was kind of a surprise. This nib is a bit larger than the Pilot number 5 size nibs that you see on like the Metropolitan and the Explorer and all those lower end Pilot pens. But this has, with it being a little bit larger, it feels like it has a little more bounce to it. And it's usually a very enjoyable nib to write with, but like the Kakuno, it felt kind of dry. And this ink has kind of surprised me. I've just finished using Kaweco Palm Green in a pen, a Kaweco Lilliput, and I just did some writing samples with Kaweco Summer Purple, and that ink was also very enjoyable to use in a wide range of nibs. And this ink just feels a little watery. That Palm Green and Summer Purple feel a little more viscous in the nib and just provide a better writing experience, I feel. And I was expecting the same thing with Sunrise Orange, but it does feel more watery in the nib, and in this case makes the pen feel a bit drier. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This is a bit wetter than the first two nibs, and I got this pen out after doing a few writing samples on different types of paper and just feeling how dry the ink felt. I thought, well, I'm going to get my Pilot 14 karat nib out, the fine nib, and see if it feels any better. It does feel a bit smoother, though I wouldn't call it, I don't know if this will make any sense, but it doesn't feel feedbacky, but it feels like the nib is gripping the paper To me, it's not unpleasant, especially after using these first two that felt kind of dry. So I don't know how to describe this. Maybe I'll just say it feels nice. So if you're going to use a fine nib with this ink, I suggest something nice wet and something that is smooth for a fine nib, smooth compared to other fine nibs. Next, I've got my Kaweco AL Sport. It has a stainless steel medium nib. You can see I made a mistake choosing this nib to use with this ink. I knew this medium nib ran a bit dry. With these little Kaweco nibs, you have variation from nib to nib. Like I have an extra fine and a broad nib that write a bit wetter, and my fine and medium nibs tend to be a bit drier. Well, I picked this medium nib because I thought it would pair nicely with this orange ink. I thought I would see some shading. I thought if I got too wet of a nib, it would just be too uniform in color. But this nib just feels too dry. In fact, I guess it looks okay if you like a lighter colored ink, but I prefer my ink to look a bit richer, have a bit more character to it, and this just feels too dry. Next, I've got my Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This platinum medium nib I tend to prefer with pale colored inks, and this feels nice. It's got feedback, and you can hear the feedback, but I think it's nice. If you don't like feedback, this might be a bit too much, but I just I'm not fond of the way the ink looks out of this nib. I like it better in the Pilot. The Pilot, well, you've got probably the same amount of ink going down for each one of these, but the ink is concentrated into a finer line, so it's a little less bright. It's like a darker, richer orange, and this looks a bit more, just too bright for my taste. But I thought it felt pretty nice writing on the page. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. With this Pilot medium nib, I get the same kind of feeling on the page that I did with the Custom 74. It's not feedbacky, but it's not smooth. It's like it's kind of gripping the page. I think I preferred the feeling of the fine nib, though I'm a fine nib person, and I just like the way it looked better. It's a bit darker. With the medium nib, I'm seeing more of the splotchy kind of shading, and with some inks, I'm okay with that, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm as fond of it. This is just a personal preference on my end, though, with this one. What did I said I would just call this nice. Yeah, it does feel nice writing on the page. Next, I'll be writing with my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a 14 karat broad nib. Out of all these pens, this was my favorite feel of the way the nib feels on the paper. You've got some nice shading here with this broad nib. I like the color orange. I guess I'm just not fond of writing with orange. I would call this one, on this paper, it was smooth. I guess it's going to be difficult for me to give an objective opinion about this because I'm just not fond of writing with orange inks, or if orange inks that are too bright, maybe. Though I wouldn't call this a bright orange. It's still not dusky enough for me. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This ink, even though it doesn't look like it, it's kind of a watery ink. It's one of those inks that I have to put a little extra pressure on the page to get it to grab, to get the ink to grab the page on certain nibs. Not every nib was like that. But I guess I was expecting this ink to be richer, like Kaweco Palm Green and Summer Purple, but this is a watery ink. All right, while that dries, let's take a look at my writing sample on Rhodia. With the glass nib, my dip nib, it had a little trouble grabbing the paper up here. I had to scribble a little bit before it grabbed the paper. Writing, it didn't want to grab the paper. However, my 1.5 stub nib did better at grabbing the paper than it did on, let's see, I forgot what brand this is. It's a really smooth paper, but on my ink collection card, I had trouble getting the tweezers to grab it. I had trouble even making the swatch. When I was writing the name of the ink, I had trouble getting the dip nib to grab it. It looks good, but I really had trouble writing this. And the stub nib, you can see, didn't want to hold on to the paper. But it did okay on the Rhodia. But my glass dip nib didn't do well. So I got off to kind of a bad start with this ink. But when I got to my broad nib on my Lilliput, it was nice. It felt nice to write with, and it looks nice. The Custom Heritage 91 medium nib was nice and smooth. But a lot of the other pens just felt dry, so I didn't have it out originally, but I went ahead and got my Custom 74 with the gold fine nib, and it felt nice. And you can see it's got a darker look to it. I just like the way the ink looks in that finer nib. It puts down enough ink that it's nice and opaque. I don't like when the ink, all of it looks translucent. I think in general, I like richer, opaque inks. I'm not fond of writing with any ink really on printer paper, but there were a couple pens that felt nice. The Kaweco Broad. The Custom Heritage 91 was smooth, but a lot of times those Pilot Gold nibs, the ink just wants to blob out on the paper, and it felt like it was maybe a little bit too wet. Like the Custom 74, it looked kind of just slightly blobby. It was something maybe you would only notice if you were the one writing it. The Kaweco just felt too dry. But the 3776 felt nice, and it looked really nice. It didn't look blobby on the paper. And I thought with this ink being kind of a watery ink, it might bleed through pretty bad, but no. Summer Purple bled through a bit more on the same kind of paper, but Sunrise Orange, you can't hardly even tell I've written on the other side of the paper. And I was surprised by the Lucina. It felt so dry on all the other papers, but on this copy paper, it felt really nice. It was like a finer version of the Platinum nib. My writing sample that I did in my old bullet journal, my Leuchtturm bullet journal. Really had trouble getting that stub nib to grab the paper. So this is usually an enjoyable writing sample to do. Summer Purple was very nice, but I wasn't fond of Sunrise Orange on this paper. I discovered early on that I'm not fond of writing with orange inks, even though orange is one of my favorite colors. Iroshizuku Yuyaki was one of the first inks I got, and it's got some nice shading properties, but I just never was fond of writing with it. I tend to like Sunrise Orange better. It's not as bright as Yuyaki. Noodler's Apache Sunset has more yellow in it when it shades, and it's a pretty ink, but I still prefer Sunrise Orange. Three Oysters Buchanson is a fairly pale ink. You can see it had trouble grabbing the paper when I did the tweezer swatch, but it was an ink that I enjoyed using when I tested it. It's not a bright ink. It's pale but not bright. I'm not sure why I picked up a sample of Jacques Herbin Orange Soleil. It is so bright. And I was just on a Jacques Herbin kick there for a while. I discovered that I really liked some of those inks, and I guess I picked up a sample of this, but this is way out of the range of inks that I like to write with. This would be a nice ink for marking up documents, though. I picked up Iroshizuku Fuyugaki when I was looking for a substitute for KWZ Grapefruit, but this is way brighter than KWZ Grapefruit. It's got a lot of red in it, which I do kind of like in my orange inks, but this has that more subdued characteristic to it, so I tend to prefer Sunrise Orange over Fuyugaki. KWZ Grapefruit was my favorite orange ink there for a while. I would always say it was my favorite orange and my favorite red ink. It really leans heavily into the red, and I like it in fine nibs, but Sunrise Orange is a more true orange, and I prefer this in broader nibs. Tasha Hokusai Benetsuchi is also one of my favorite. I don't know if you could technically call this orange. To me, it has some really good shading properties. It leans toward brown. It really looks brown here beside Sunrise Orange, but I like that it's darker and richer. It's got a little bit of sheen to it, and it's got a little bit of water resistance to it. I liked that. And Lamy Mango was my least favorite of all the orange-ish types of inks that I tested. It's just way too pale, not very legible at all. Honestly, all of these orange inks I think are pretty to look at, just not very pleasant to write with from a legibility standpoint for me. And some of them are unpleasant just because of the way they feel on the paper. And Sunrise Orange kind of falls into that category. It's one of the nicer looking orange inks, but it's just too watery for me, and that really came as a surprise after using Palm Green and Summer Purple, which are two inks that I just absolutely love. And I didn't expect this when it came to water resistance after seeing the water resistance of Palm Green and Summer Purple. They weren't waterproof, but they each had a water-resistant component, and I was expecting that with Sunrise Orange since it has a little bit of a dusky character to it, but it just disappeared. I did a writing sample with each of the pens from the previous writing tests, and this is rhodia paper. I submerged it in water for 10 minutes. That's what I do for all my water resistance tests, and yeah. Let's take a look at the back of this page. Just got kind of deep into the paper on that drip at the end of the swatch. Not a whole lot of show through because it's a lighter ink. The two pilot pens were nice on this paper, but I did like the platinum on the copy paper. Inks like this where you have to be conscious of what pen you're putting it in or what paper you're going to be writing on. I tend not to prefer those types of inks. I prefer it to be kind of a no-brainer. You have an ink, you can put it in any pen, write on fountain pen friendly papers, and you're okay. So I guess I was expecting too much from this ink. I went into it having high expectations. I'm glad I did this writing test because I had bottles of palm green, summer purple, and sunrise orange in my cart. I was getting ready to buy bottles of those three, and I can tell this is an ink that I wouldn't enjoy writing with. I looked for the water resistance test for Kaweco Caramel Brown. That was another ink that it was enjoyable to write with, but I just don't use brown inks that often. I think it had a little bit of water resistance to it. I'm going to have to look around some more and see if I can find that water resistance test that I did. Just looking at this writing sample, this dark part up here where my glass dip nib put down a lot of ink, I really like it, but this is just a little, just slightly too light for me. And that's just a personal preference thing. My recommendation for this ink is if you are going to use it, if you like this color, use it in a wetter nib and something that is smooth. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.